Hey there, everybody. I hope that you have a pair of shoes on right now because I want to talk about how a pair of shoes, two of them, can be about a paired passage. I have two different sets of shoes here, one that belongs to one pair and one to a different pair. And the passage that I want to talk about today is one called Trees Rise in the Desert. The other passage that was part of the paired passage, pair of shoes, was Legacy of Stone. And I noticed that they had a similar theme. So laces on shoes, by the time your passage is finished, your conclusion is sort of like your shoes that have laces that tie everything in that passage together. The trees that rise in the desert. The other passage, the legacy, make sure I say it right, a legacy of stone. The other passage was about rocks and doing something with rocks. And I noticed that they both had a common theme, that when both people on these two literary nonfiction, real things that happened in the past, they had a lace that tied them together. People made fun of the characters in both passages, but that's not the only thing that connected them like laces together. Everything in one passage ties together. So we could have a pair of shoes. We could have a pair of passages. We could have some paragraphs, or we can have one passage, but everything in a passage ties together like the shoes and the laces. So the other way that I want to connect a paired passage to you is that if you think about a passage, every passage has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Introduction, body, conclusion, beginning, a middle, and an end. And sometimes they're going to ask you questions just about those passages separately. How do they fit together? How do you infer? How do you read between the lines? How do you, if this is your introduction and this is your body and this is your conclusion, the question we're going to look at today is how do you draw a conclusion about one of the passages based on what's in one paragraph? Now, it wasn't asking to draw a conclusion about the entire passage. It was only asking you to draw a conclusion about paragraph 1, 2, 3. That after reading paragraph 3, what conclusion could you draw? And so what we're going to do is we're going to count how many sentences that paragraph had to check the content, because whatever conclusion we draw, whatever last finger that we put, what conclusion can be drawn is the sentence that could tie the entire paragraph together, especially to the last few sentences that have been written. So let's take a look at one way to teach this. This is a 7th grade question. And the question, before I get to it, let me make sure I get you the correct. Only 44% of the 7th graders in Texas knew how to draw a conclusion based on one paragraph, one series of sentences. And I believe there were about 7 or 8 sentences inside the paragraph. So let's take a look. I'm going to share my screen with you. to give you a couple ideas. So here's the passage that we're going to be focusing on, and it's one of the two. They both happen to be literary nonfiction stories, real stories, not fake things that happened in the past. And they didn't ask about paragraph 1, but something in paragraph 3 that they were asking about 24 made me have to go back to paragraph 1. Something I didn't know, there was content, vocabulary that I didn't understand. So I had to rewind my story to get to the point. And so think of red as rewinding and green as fast forwarding. So let's take a look real quick at the question in question. Which conclusion is supported by the information in paragraph 3 of the selection, Rise in the Desert? Now, the only reason, I'm going to let you know this again, the only reason I had to go back to paragraph 1 is because of a phrase inside paragraph 3 that I did not understand. And once I had an understanding of what that phrase meant, I was able to easily answer the question. So there you have a picture. The paragraph that we're going to look at, number 3, had 8 sentences, and we'll look closely at the last 3, sentence 6, 7, and 8, so that we can decide if I could draw a conclusion, what sentence, what conclusion could I draw? And so I went ahead and made it a little bit bigger. A drawn conclusion is like the last lace on a pair of shoes that either ties the paragraph together or the passage. And since it was only about paragraph 3, about Zay or Zai farming and how it works, that's my title, that's my focus, my bullseye. And so we would need to look at sentences 5, 6, 7, and 8 as we go towards the end of the paragraph and think, okay, what conclusion can be drawn? So I don't want to leave you in the dust on this. So what I would like to do is show you what I did before we read. I took my read advising graphic organizer and I went ahead and wrote the hashtags, the keywords for each sentence, not in the entire passage, but only paragraph 3 for question number 24 in 7th grade. And you notice that the hand that I have already only has 5 fingers, but since the paragraph has 8, all I did was I drew 8 fingers in total. I drew 3 extra with the keywords from each one, and it's going to be that pinky and these extra fingers that I drew so that we should be able to infer, to read between the lines in a way. What was it that they were trying to say that could bring closure, that could draw a conclusion based on this paragraph? So unless I read it to you, you won't be able to make that connection. So let's read the paragraph together. I'll zoom in for those of you that are nearsighted to make sure that you can see it pretty well. Put it in the right position for you. Get everything else out of the way. There we go. All right. Sawadogo patiently explained that rain would come eventually. So he's talking to somebody about rain coming. And there is a picture of him planting a tree. And apparently, because of our title, T, that helps us understand the topic, he's hoping to make trees rise or grow in the desert. That's what I can infer, because there he is planting one, and you can see the desert all around him. What it did, when it did, future tense, most of it would run off of the ground surface, which was baked hard as concrete. So that's a problem. But in his field, the Zais would catch and hold much more of the precious water than the dry ground could alone. So whatever this size was, I'm gonna have to figure out what it is. So I went ahead and read the rest of the paragraph first to see, is there something that's gonna give me more information about what size are? Moisture. And so I would tell my kids, if you don't know what a word is, you can say blah, blah, blah. And we lost some meaning there. There's a gap in our learning. Moisture would linger longer underground through the dry season with whatever this xy type of planting or farming is. The damp, rich compost would, future tense, continue to nourish his sprouting crops and the small trees he planted. Dogo said that in 20 years' time, future, he could visualize a lush green field and forest taking place of the rocky, barren desert. So if you look behind me in my virtual screen, there's a golf course. It was probably just a bunch of rocks and brown grass and ugly looking background that happened to be next to some water. And now you have a beautiful golf course that's lush and it's green, and you can see trees growing, and you can see that they're well nourished and healthy. And so then it got to that part that made me wonder what they meant. Xy farming was really an old method that Africans had used long ago. So apparently this Xy method that he's using is going to have an effect in the future of all these things. It used to be done in the old days. So I've got to find out by rewinding, what does it mean when you're doing Xy farming versus regular farming? It had worked once, perhaps it was time to try it again. So those last sentences are very crucial. Those are the last two laces on one shoe called paragraph 3. They're also the last two fingers of the hand. So we have to pay close attention. If I was to add one finger to that last sentence, what could it be that would draw it all together? So I have intentionally taken out my English storytelling remote. I'm going to turn on the power, and we skipped all the way to paragraph 3. We played, but when I play it at slow, it's sort of what you might call still step. And so when I did that, I was able to take the paragraph one by one and be able to break it down for you, explaining that the rains are going to come eventually. Good thing. Most of it would run off the ground surface, baked as hard as concrete. That's bad. That's how it's happening right now. His vision, his dream of the future is sentences 3, 4, 5, 6, and the reason why he did it is sentence 7 and 8. So all the good things that are going to happen with Xy farming. So after I got there, I was like, oh my Gandhi, I better read. I better push this button. I need to rewind back to the first paragraph, the first shoe that has some laces that tie everything together. And I want to have you notice something that I wrote in the title underneath it. Life happens at full speed. And the rest of the saying is, if you want to make a sign on your classroom wall, comma, but reading and writing happen in slow motion, one detail and sentence at a time. So when we slow life down, in this case, because it starts as a story, think of arms. We use arms for revising by adding, removing, replacing, and moving. And some of you use substituting. But for reading, we're going to do actors remember more story sequence. I want to find out what in the world is this farming called Xi farming by acting it out. So let me push my button. And for those of you that have a short memory, I go ahead and write down what all of the buttons on the storytelling remote, because lots of reading passages are like this one: literary nonfiction, real things that did happen; fiction, fake things that did not happen but could; poems of things that did happen or are happening right now; plays of things that did happen. So lots of chances to use what I call a storytelling remote. And I'm going to push pause once in a while to do teachable moments so that we can kind of understand the concept of what the Xi farming is all about. So let's push still step. The villagers laughed as they watched their neighbor, Farmer Yakauba Zawadogo, digging dozens of holes in the rock hard soil of the field. And so he's digging holes by the dozens, by the 12s. And the reaction is the villagers laughing. They're not laughing with him, they're laughing at him. So there's already the condescending attitude that you'll also see in the other passage called A Legacy of Stone, where people make fun of that character as well for a completely different reason. Each pit or Xi, so a pit is a Xi. So if you've ever seen a field where they're growing crops of some kind, you see ground soil that's risen, and then there's what looks sort of what like many of you might relate to a bowling alley, if some of you know what that is, where it's a little bit lower. That part I would imagine would be called the pits. So he's digging dozens of holes. Each pit, or Xi as he called them, was about a foot wide. So a foot wide, that's about 12 inches, and 8 inches deep. So if this is 4 inches when I close my hand, 8 inches deep is that much depth. I want you to be able to see that picture. The people laughed even harder when he began filling each hole with a mixture of cattle manure, leaves, and any other organic material that he could find. So he wasn't planting seeds yet. He was putting poop, leaves, and other organic material that he could find inside those holes. Finally, he carefully buried seeds in each compost bed. So apparently mixed in with the manure, the leaves, and the other organic material, he was putting the seeds, where most people would just put the seeds and put some water and expect something to happen. And then because there's somebody talking, I'm going to push voice there because there's some dialogue. Somebody says something. Do you actually expect those seeds to grow water? Someone called. So basically, it gives you a snapshot, a little video. You think of a sentence like a picture. A paragraph is sort of like a video. We get to see a little picture of him actually doing it and being made fun of. So now you know what Xi farming is. The biggest difference is that with Xi farming, they have manure from cattle, cows, leaves of some sort, and any other organic nature-made material that he could find. So I'm going to push the skip button because now I know what Zy farming is. And so he's thinking that in the future, doing this method under these dry conditions is going to create and allow the water to stay in the ground a lot longer than it would when it's dry and hard on the surface. And so all of these sentences tie together in some way, either using the laces on a shoe, as you see here in the two drawings that I used. What is it that they said at the end? And so let's take a look at our answer choices and see people are eager to learn new ways to farm. In paragraph 1, eager is an emotion. There was no anxiety. People were making fun of the old ways of farming. That would have been the truth. But in paragraph 1, it was people making fun. In paragraph 3, the only person that was eager to try a way to farm was the fancy dude's name. What was his name? Let me look at it. Sawadogo. And he was trying an old way to farm. So I would eliminate letter choice F, because nothing was about that. The desert landscape naturally encourages plant growth. The opposite of encourage is discourage. Because of what they said in the sentence right here, to this negative attribute, most of it would run off the ground surface because it was baked as hard as concrete. So it was so hard, the moisture couldn't even get inside down to where the place was where they planted the seeds. So because of that sentence, it contradicts what a desert landscape would naturally do. Zy farming is the only successful way to prevent desertification. Well, it was a way to use desert to be able to plant. They didn't say it was the only way. They basically said it, he said it in the last two sentences, which are critical to our answer choice. He said, let's take a look. Zy farming was an old method, and perhaps it's time to try it again. He would not have tried it again if it hadn't worked in the past in moments of dryness and desert and the way their world was at that time. So I don't think that's going to be a successful way. So I'm going to eliminate that one. It can be helpful to look to the past for answers. Well, because when you look closely at sentence 6, Sadego visualized the lush green field because of the things that he did in paragraph 1, an old way. He was visualizing, he had a vision, he was able to imagine what was going to happen. Without a vision, the people perish, a saying says. Zy farming was an old method used long ago, so perhaps it was great to try it again. So if I was to add, it's helpful to look to the past for answers. They had a problem. The conflict was that the plants were growing, but instead of coming to his rescue, everyone spent all their time laughing at Sawadogo and making fun of him because he was willing to do something different. And so what's the answer? I'm going to say that the 56% of the kids who got it wrong didn't realize that all they had to do was look at those last couple of sentences. In the past, this is the way they did it. So this is probably the way it's going to work now. So we would eliminate letters F, G, and H. And some kids never made it to J. And so whether you're using the hand to write in the last fingers or the laces on real shoes, might not be able to figure out the answer to this kind of a question. So a suggestion, if you like the shoe idea, if you're working with paired passages, have your kids bring a left shoe and a right shoe from two different pairs, and you'll read one together, you'll read the other one together, and you're going to answer questions about each one individually, usually about 3 or 4. Then you'll answer questions. There are about 3 or 4 questions about how they are similar and how they're untied, how they're not related, how they contrast with each other, how they're different. Because in both passages, people made fun of the characters, but what was the reaction of the characters? We can sort of tell from this one, a tree in trees rising in the desert. It didn't seem like the character was going to allow anyone to discourage him from doing what he thought was going to make a difference. So based on paragraph 3 and having to rewind just enough to figure out what xi farming was, we'll be able to figure out the answer. And so connection to life and extension, going beyond, what is something in the past that used to work that maybe people stopped doing and now it's not working? Think about your community, your city, your county, your state, the culture. There are some things historically, science-wise, like this one was, that were things that were said or done or methods from the past. What's different that needs to be fixed? Some problems. I think one of them, if I was to be the teacher and say the teacher should go first, we're living in a culture where there are rules that are just completely disregarded, that we want rewards whether we follow those rules or not, but we don't want the consequences. And sometimes the consequences are different depending on who you are. And I think at the end of every sentence, there should be a period when a rule says follow oral, written, and directions the first time they're given. The first rule that I would teach my students, then there's going to be a reward for kids who do things when I ask them to do them. And there's going to be a consequence, a very real, relative, practical consequence if I have to ask things more than once. So we've gotten away from rules, rewards, and consequences that are strict, that are enforced, and supported by administration. There has to be a returning of really radical classrooms that have rules, rewards, and consequences, or we're in big trouble. Now that's just my example. So if I do a life connection to this, what are some other ways that that conclusion that was drawn, that sometimes we have to look to the past for answers. What was working back then that is no longer working now? So talk about that with your students. Think about it yourself. What is working in your own personal life? Or let's say what was working, rewinding, and something happened. There was a contrasting, there was an event or an experience that triggered a contrast where something's different now. The teeter had a transition that is different than the totter. The C, you could see that things were going really well back then. And then there was a transition, and we saw that the effect, the result, changed into something that was a negative impact, something that we did not want. So the conflict there is, what concepts from the past can we look to help us fix things in the present so they can change our future? So that's my lesson for today. I think that you can pick the hand method with fingers with the main ideas, or the shoelace that ties everything together. One of those, just differentiate your instruction in a way that kids can relate to. And you're either going to give them a hand or a high five or give me the answer, or you might say, I have a $25 gift card. If you want to be a big spender as a reward, who's the one that can tie this paragraph together and give me a lace? Not just the one that's already given, but what other conclusion can be drawn? It might be something like this. In spite of the fact that people are going to make fun of you for trying something different, don't give up if you know in your heart that the path you're taking is the right one. Because that's what that guy did. He didn't give up. And I'm hoping that his future looks exactly like my background, full of lush green grass, beautiful, colorful flowers, plants lined along the rows. And sometimes what people think is a bunch of poop can turn into the most beautiful masterpiece you can ever imagine. Take care.